So today on the Grand Jewels, we are joined by the broadcaster and columnist Martin Kelner. And as any fans of fighting talk could possibly imagine, Martin has chosen Swinton, and specifically Station Road, Swinton, as his Grand Jewel. Martin, welcome to the programme. And why Swinton?
Well, that's when I grew up with, James. I was born just near Manchester, and it was my father, really. You know, he was a rugby league fan, and his friends were rugby league fans. They went to see rugby league. So I wasn't really that connected with. I'm talking about the early '60s now, and I wasn't that connected with football at all. I used to occasionally go to Main Road to see Manchester City. But, you know, Swinton was what I grew up with, and it's always that way, isn't it, really? It's your parents or your father, usually, that inculcates the love of whatever it is. And it was, and Swinton were a great side when I was growing up.
Yeah, and in the '60s, what a time to be inculcated. It's you've got back-to-back league championships in '63 and '64, a team which included the likes of Kangeroos, Johnny Stopford, Alan Buckley. Some great names and an exciting backline, quite an attacking side for the day, I believe.
Hugely attacking side, and the great thing about the Swinton ground was it was at the maximum width for a rugby league ground. Well, for a rugby ground, so it was wider, bigger. There was more space for for attacking movements. So almost because of the dimensions of the ground, the team became fast-flowing play with the backs, the three quarters, became the thing. That's why the names you mentioned there, Buckley and Stopford and Gowers, they were all the backs. That's what Swinton were famous for. And there were various moves there. You could almost, it's brilliant because you could almost see the moves working out where they were, because it was a big ground, and we had huge stands on, a massive, big, tall wooden stand on one side, and a big, long wooden stand on the other side. So you got a good perspective on it. If you could see where the centres were going to join the line and all that sort of thing. So it was great to watch. It really was.
Yeah, and it absolutely sounds it. And for people who aren't necessarily familiar with Station Road in Swinton, because it closed down or was sold in 1992, yeah. It is a huge ground, a capacity of 60,000. A capacity that was probably never reached, actually. I think.
No,
when you could see one of those things, grounds like Murrayfield, which has like, when it had the banks, it's just like, well, we reckon we can get about 60,000 on there. We're not sure. We're not going to count. We'll just let anyone in who comes. And you mentioned those sort of two, because there's sort of grandstand style, and I think for people to sort of imagine. It's kind of similar to the Crumbie stand at Welford Road. The other one that springs to mind when looking at it is just a very weird pull, I understand, but the King's Lynn's main stand at the Walks. And it's this elevated grandstand with terracing below, but you've got these wooden benches and sort of seats where you can get this, like say, elevated view. It was quite a imposing structure, wasn't it?
Well, it was amazing, really. I mean, as you mentioned, it was built in 1929, which is probably a bit of a triumph of optimism over experience, because you were never going to get a massive ground with 60,000 people. But Swinton itself is a small town just outside Manchester. It's actually part of Salford, as the borough goes. And when I was growing up, there was still a hugely active coal mining area. It had a really strong industrial base. A lot of it based around coal mining. And you mentioned the big banks like Murrayfield and everything. The top of one of the terraces, it was a slag heap. It was basically coal. So you were standing on, it was there were terracing steps going up. I mean, for big internationals and semi-finals, you would occasionally get people standing right the way up to the top. I think the record was about 40-odd thousand for a Wigan Warrington semi-final. They used to have, obviously it was a great source of pride, to go along to Station Road and know that this was the ground that was going to be used for internationals. Saw a few Great Britain-Australia matches at Swinton, and used for the big semi-finals as well. And those were the occasions occasions when it was absolutely packed. When we used to go, like I say, in the 60s, probably if they were playing a Wigan or a St Helens, a very big local rival, there would still be 10, 12,000 possibly there, but no more. That seemed quite, because the 60,000 capacity was a little more of an optimism than anything else. It still seemed quite full. The terraces were quite full. Behind the goals tended to be not so full. But if there would still be, you'd have the real feeling of a big sporting occasion if we were playing Wigan or Widnes or somebody.
It very quickly became a big ground, and in the sort of speed that couldn't happen nowadays. The ground was broken in 1929. It was opened in later in 1929, so put up really quickly. And by January 1930, it's hosting its first Ashes match, and it hosts Test matches from the 30s through to the 70s. Challenge Cup semi-finals until as late as 84, the Premiership final all throughout the 70s. It's sort of the neutral ground to go in when you need a Lancashire neutral ground. And it obviously helped that for a lot of that period of time, Swinton weren't getting to those finals.
No, that's absolutely true. Nearly did it. We nearly did it so many times, but never got to Wembley. We actually won the cup just before I think it was 28. You probably know about the years, 28 or 29, but we won it just before the ground was built. And then there was a year when it wasn't played at Wembley because of refurbishments or whatever was going on at Wembley. So we missed out. We never actually got to Wembley. We nearly did, a few times, but never quite made it, which was a shame. But we did host the big semi-finals, and we also, the Australian touring team used to play club sides. And we beat the Australians a couple of times. I did see Swinton beat the Australians in a very tight match at Station Road. That would be sort of early 70s, I think, or late 60s.
One of the great things that's sort of lost from sort of modern sport, not enough. I mean, obviously the invention of the aeroplane is great, but when people are coming over on the boats and feeling like they've got to make the most of the time their journey, playing those club sides was a great thing. Mm. I was struck as well because, as you say, it's really wide and it's really interesting. And I didn't know the tidbit there about the slag heap, but you've also got, from pictures that I've seen, there's like a squash club or a social club that was sort of like
that came in the sort of late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, that was much later. That was because there was one side that there was banking on that side of the ground that was rarely used. As crowds dwindled certainly in the 80s, as the team, wasn't the great team it used to be. Crowds dwindled to 2,000 or 3,000, and there obviously they didn't need that side. They tried all sorts of things. I mean, I think it was largely the reason it sort of dwindled, and eventually they sold the grounds, and in '92 it closed down, was because the whole nature of the area changed. It didn't have the huge industrial base that it used to have. It was more sort of subsumed into Salford and Manchester. So Swinton didn't have an identity of its own. And eventually in the early 90s, we moved to Gig Lane in Bury, which was quite fun as well, because if you ever speak to a Bury fan, that's an interesting ground as well. But yeah, so the squash club came later and was one of several attempts to revive the ground, to some extent, make it possibly more of a community facility. But it never really worked because the sort of community had finished. There wasn't the community, there wasn't the industry that there used to be. Excuse me, and it was all part of Manchester, it was part of Salford. So identity was lost. And there were all sorts of schemes that were going to try and revive the whole thing, but it never did, which is a great shame.
Absolutely a great shame. So when you're thinking of Station Road, because it does go through a bit of a change at the end. I mean, But when I was looking, I watched a match from the mid 80s, and you've got that other grandstand that you talked about, or the stand on the other side. And by the time you're watching the last match, '92, which is the derby against Salford, where they win to stay up, and you guys are relegated to the second division. That whole stand is gone as well, and the people on the Townsend Road are getting a free view of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what it was the Bradford City fire as well, because you're looking at wooden stands. So as soon as after the Bradford City fire, I can't remember what year that was, but shortly after that, they restricted, so you could not sit in as many seats in the main stand. So that was, and the other stand was demolished on the other side, as you say. So it was in its death throes. I mean, the really sad thing is it was sold for housing development, and there isn't even a street name, named after anybody that played for Swinton in that era when it was such a vital part of the community, and there's no trace of anything.
There's a teeny tiny plaque, like a very very small plaque. It looks like a little like the thing you do, like a brass rubbing. Basically, you can imagine children of the future being sent there to the brass rubbing of the Station Road plaque, and imagine what was once there.
I didn't. That's a more recent innovation, because excuse me, when it was first, demolished in the 90s, I never remember there being anything there. I went back once or twice, and it was just houses, really.
I think the development, it's called the gateways. But yeah, I was looking at there is no evidence of those groups, and it's a bit of a shame, because for me and for fans of sports grounds, when they go, there is the sadness, but there are ways to preserve them and honour them. The developments at Highbury and Roker Park and Highfield Road, they make features out of like the centre circle or things like that, and it's not the same as having a ground there, but at least it's paying tribute to the heritage of the area rather than coming up with something generic. So yeah, definitely a shame. Can I take you back? Do you remember the first time you went to Station Road? Do you remember? I mean, you say your dad took it. Are you going there with your brother as well? Or
yeah, I used to go regularly with my brother. He was a keen Swinton fan, the same as me. And the first time I went would be, see, my parents, my dad is from an immigrant community, and they lived in the heart of Salford and supported a team called Bellevue Rangers, which is one of those rugby league teams that went out of existence. Bellevue Rangers and Broughton Rangers. So that was the same team, but they changed the name, and they support. So he was sort of looking for, and with his friends, they were looking for another team to support. And I think rugby league seemed to appeal to sort of immigrant displaced community sort of thing, because it's a simple game, rugby league, I think, and it's very you can get attached to it. It's much more simple than rugby union, for instance, probably more than football, and a lot of them used to go together. So he probably took me around about 1960. About 1960, I would say, probably the turn of the 60s when I first went with my dad. So I remember that quite well. The other thing I remember about Swinton is they had a very powerful PA system, which is a bizarre thing to remember. But we used to park the car because we didn't want to get stuck in the car park. We'd park the car a couple of streets away, and used to walk through a little park area, which I think was called Folly Lane, I think. And there was an amateur rugby league team used to play. So we'd stop and watch a bit of that team, just, playing on the Saturday afternoon, as it was in those days. And you could hear the PA quite clearly, so you could hear the team changes and things like that. But also, they had a very good I don't know who it was. He was never named, but the guy who put the music on, had a, a really good record collection, and you would hear the very, because at that point you was about sort of Beatles era. It was just about starting, and I can remember hearing "I Feel Fine" by the Beatles. At about 65, that would probably be a very high volume, on this, and it was the first time I'd heard the song. And the fact that you could hear the music as you were going across the fields to go into the ground was great. It was part of the experience. Really enjoyed it.
That sounds amazing. I was explaining to my daughter the other day that if you wanted to hear some music, obviously now you just say, Alexa, play whatever you want. We had to take the bus into town and listen to the records in the shop to find out what we liked. And she looked at me like I was from a complete other planet.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can imagine. I mean, and maybe it's to do with the size of the ground as well, because you've got this big ground. You need that kind of big pumping sort of PA system. But it's strange, those things that you remember. I obviously have no memories of, but looking back at some of the footage, and there's lots of footage, you see, because grandstand would often be there. They'd show the second half, not the first half, because obviously if people saw a whole game, it would ruin the fabric of society, wouldn't it? But so they would cut to the match in the second half in progress. But it's one of these things that just struck me that you just wouldn't tolerate now. But it had massive pylons for the floodlights, 4 of them, like obstructing the view of the cameras, and the cameras worked around them. But it's just it's one of the things that just wouldn't happen in a modern ground.
No, and it's interesting, those floodlight pylons. We have the great man David Attenborough to thank for that. David Attenborough introduced when BBC Two started, and he wanted things that could be shown in colour, and sport obviously was one of those things that was colour. And he brought in tennis. Obviously, Wimbledon was, I think, one of the first things he brought in. But he also started the Rugby League Floodlit Cup. So rugby league teams had to suddenly get floodlights, and so it was thanks to him that those huge floodlight pylons were put up. And we got to the final. That was one of the last things. Sometime in the late 60s, we got to the final of the BBC Two Floodlit Trophy. I think we played Castleford, but we had decent floodlights, and not every rugby league ground did, so that sort of helped us get a bit of television on a Tuesday night on BBC Two, and it was David Attenborough who was controller of BBC Two at the time.
Yeah, it's amazing, the innovation from that time, and I know you've written a fantastic book on the history of sport and television, and that shift to colour and kind of what it does, and brings in also Sunday Grandstand and and really popularises snooker and things like that. So it's amazing to think it's the guy who does the nature programmes.
Yes, it's amazing. And yellow tennis balls as well. If it wasn't for David Attenborough, we wouldn't have yellow tennis balls. They were only yellow when, of course, they started televising Wimbledon, which was I think the first colour thing. I may be wrong. It's in my book, but I'm possibly wrong. I think the first colour broadcast was a Wimbledon final. In fact, I think I wrote it down because I thought it was an interesting. It was Roger Taylor versus Cliff Drysdale, and it was he brought in the yellow tennis balls, obviously better for TV.
But you see, I mean, it makes sense, but I've just assumed they were always yellow. And I guess that's the thing, that's the thing when things become so synonymous and they're used everywhere as. Yeah, no, that's sort of, it's fascinating because I know your book explores it as well in terms of it's sort of how sport shaped TV and then how TV goes on to then shape sport. There's a real kind of two-way relationship there, and obviously there are some winners out of that, and then there are definitely some losers out of that as well.
You know more stuff about Station O than I do, actually. I've forgotten most of it.
Do you know what? When you said you were picking Station Road, like I was like, well, obviously it's going to be this quaint little rugby league thing somewhere like Oldham's, like Watersheddings, or the Willows and Salford. I was like, that's great. I love those type of grounds. And then you look into the history of it, and you just feel like, and the decline of it, and the fact that. And I'm very biased. I'm against Old Trafford. I hate Old Trafford as a rugby league ground. Every time the Super League Grand Final is there, and you've got those tiny in-goal areas which aren't fit for purpose, it just really frustrates me. And then learning about this great rugby league stadium in Greater Manchester that was just allowed to decline and never replaced is quite frustrating. But yeah. Less of my views, more of yours. One of the things that obviously with rugby league is that it's quite territorial. It's that M62 corridor. I live in North Nottinghamshire, and there's been various attempts over the years to get a team in Mansfield and Nottingham, and they've never worked. So I feel like I understand the game and I love the game, but I don't understand the sport because I'm not from one of its heartlands. Why do you? But then I look at that M62 corridor going all the way from St Helens all the way to Hull. There does seem to be a bit of a gap around Manchester. And obviously with the decline of Swinton and Salford not. Why is Manchester this little bit of sort of almost like this gap on that rugby league landscape?
Well, I mean, clearly one of the reasons is that, football is it's pretty big in Manchester.
Yeah.
You'll have heard of United and City, fairly big teams. So that's obviously one of the reasons, that if you're growing up in Manchester, you're probably going to be drawn to the two football teams. Also, rugby league is very rooted in the sort of industries of the area. So it's pit villages, it's pit towns, if you like, or it's cotton and wool towns. It's Batley and Dewsbury and Bradford, those places where you had the big industrial sort of combines. So I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, interestingly, we used to live on the main road, which is the A62, which goes from before the M62 was built. So, I am going back to a time. I'm very old. I'm going back to a time before the M62, and we used to live just off the A62. And when Swinton were playing, because we knew the sort of back doubles to drive to get to the ground, we could get there in sort of 10 minutes from where we lived, probably even less. And the main A62 was always chock-a-block with cars. If Swinton were playing Leeds or Huddersfield or one of the teams from across the other side of the Pennines, in the pre-motorway days, we could see the cars queuing up at the traffic lights and everything to get down towards Swinton. They used to go. There was a big colliery. Agecroft Colliery was the big pit, and they used to go down through there and then up a hill, and then they would arrive and have to start parking their cars near the Swinton ground. And we could see them. We could go when I was a kid. We could go out of our houses and taunt them. We could shout at their coaches and give them the finger or whatever the equivalent was in those days. So that was all fun, because we knew how to get to the ground without joining the huge queue of cars. But it was very much an A62 battle, if you like. And now, of course, the M62. Manchester, obviously, the football. See, Leeds is still a rugby league ground, and again, I don't know whether it was a lot of the people. There's a lot of the sort of Jewish community in Leeds. They were quite involved with what's now Leeds Rhinos and what's the Leeds Rugby League Club, and whether just the simplicity of rugby league did appeal to people who were from a different culture or not, I don't know, but certainly seemed to.
Makes sense, and of course, at least the red half of Manchester, from a football perspective, owes a tremendous debt to Swinton Lions, because in 1980 you managed to lure a certain Danny Wilson north to play standoff for you.
Yeah, that was great era. You know, a sort of little tiny great era, not a great era as the '60s were. But yes, Danny Wilson, who was married at that time, and his wife used to sit just near us, watching the match, and on her knee was Ryan Giggs. She used to look after Ryan Giggs, and and they'd be sitting in the stand together there. And there was an occasion when Danny got very badly injured and she went down onto the pitch. And I actually got to hold Ryan Giggs as a young boy. I mean, I wasn't a young boy, but he was, because she went down to see what was happening with her old man. Well, they do, so he grew up. I mean, he did play rugby league as well for a little bit, and could possibly have, if he'd taken a wrong turn, he could have ended up in that sport. Ended up obviously as a footballer.
He did, and what was his old man like as a player? Because I think there's a story where he said he was offered an inducement, as a lot of Welsh players were, from rugby union to come up. He was offered a house to move up to Swinton, but and because he thought of there was a sort of the unofficial colour bar in Wales, and it wasn't possible for him to be selected for Wales. He thought he'd go and he'd have a go at rugby league, but yeah, I understand he was a pretty special player at the time.
Oh, very much so. He was in that great tradition of we've just lost quite recently Barry John, and he was in that great tradition of Welsh fly halves who could sort of ghost through defences, and from if he fancied it, which he didn't always, but if he did fancy it, you would see it would bring back memories of himself and other sort of Welsh fly halves who would do that, in the great era of Welsh rugby union in the '70s. So he was great. I saw matches where he scored 5 drop goals, which wasn't unusual. In rugby league, the drop goal wasn't that much of a weapon in rugby league in those days, and he was, he was dead-eyed Dick for the drop goals, really good. But like I say, it was if he fancied it. He had all these issues with alcohol and various other things, but if he was on song, he was brilliant. He was one of the best players around at the time.
And you've touched on where Swinton have gone since. Obviously, since '92, you spent some time at Gig Lane, some time with Salford City, the football club, some time at Lee, and now you're sort of in sharing Hayward Road with Sale. There is talk, or at least was talk, of a stadium at that colliery, and I'm going to pronounce it horribly, but Agecroft?
Agecroft, yeah.
Agecroft, yeah. But that seems to have there hasn't been really much on that for 5 or 6 years. So are you perpetually destined to be tenants of other clubs in the area, or is there hope to get the club back to West Manchester?
No, there has been hope over the years, but as you say, they kept talking about Agecroft Colliery. We were going to share with Salford at one stage. And I've lost faith in the fact that I'll ever go back because, basically there's just been so much talk about it over the years, but not in recent years. So I think that's sort of finished. So they are trying to build. I mean, there's always talk of the club becoming Manchester, because it is ridiculous now. It's called Swinton Lions, but it's based in Sale, which is the wrong side of Manchester. I mean, we never went to Sale when I was growing up, so you wouldn't be. I mean, they've built up a little sort of community thing there, and there's sort of little signs of hope that something will happen at Sale, but I think they'd have to call it Manchester, really, because it would be a sort of pan-Manchester club rather than it wouldn't. I mean, it may keep the name Swinton just for historical purposes, but so I've been to Sale a few times, just for old time's sake, when they've looked like they were getting close to promotion. But it's obviously now with IMG having taken over the rugby league from a marketing perspective and everything, it's all going to be about franchises, really. So that promotion relegation thing is going to end, and that'll mean that unless they have their own ground and it's and all the facilities there and the finance and everything else. Those days are over, really.
And as we're talking, we're getting ready for the start of the Super League season. It'll probably we're about 10 days away from it. Is there anywhere left in Super League where you can go and sort of capture and experience the essence of Station Road or grounds, or like those old historic grounds? Is there anywhere that's left that's still got a kind of link to the past?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because obviously you have to modernise, along with it. But I think a Friday night match in Leeds, a Thursday or a Friday night match at Headingley, Leeds, there's still that atmosphere. It still does feel like rugby league in the old days. Those tight little grounds that you talked about, like Weldon Road or whatever they call it these days, the Castleford ground, there's still quite an atmosphere there. I'm not that, so I'm only sort of familiar with grounds near where I live. I love to go. I'd love to go along. I love to go along to Leeds, especially for a night match. That's always fun. And I suspect Hull, and certainly the Hull derbies, there's a real atmosphere there as well. St Helens and Wigan, yeah, maybe, but it's obviously not. I think what's happened, the smaller communities that were based purely around the local industry, really. So I think you're looking at Dewsbury, Batley, those sort of places. I don't think. I think the glory days are sort of over to a large extent. Forgive me if you are a Batley or a Dewsbury fan. And Bradford, that was always a great. I mean, if you're looking at the huge grounds, I went to Bradford last season when they played Swinton, and there's very little of it left. It's still, it's still there in terms of. It's still huge, or looks huge, but there are only because of health and safety and there are only various small sections of the ground being used. I mean, I was right at the top at Odsall, and it's just the game's just a rumour from up there. Really.
It is. It's a fantastic old ground, Odds, and it's obviously not. I mean, their decline has been sudden and precipitous. It's mad to think that there's now 10 years. It's a decade of no Bradford in Super League, when they were perennial grand finalists for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, the Super League, when it started, was in a way almost built round Bradford. That was because they were the first people to embrace Bradford Bulls. And then it was Leeds Rhinos.
Yeah.
So sort of Bradford were very much in on that project, but it's in a sad state of decline now. Odsall, like I say, I went to a match there last season, and it's not like it used to be. But it was a great ground in its day.
Oh, absolutely fantastic! And you bring back the memories there. And I've had a fantastic evening at Weldon Road. It's called the Menderhose Jungle.
Menderhose Jungle,
which is there we go. We've got to be fair to the sponsors, but yeah, Weldon Road. That
I take it you're a rugby union fan then, James. Is Union your game?
For my sins, yes. Rugby union. I grew up in Birmingham, so there was never a question of rugby league. And my first exposure to rugby league comes through Sky and the Super League, and then wanting to have something for Thursday and Friday nights. And I'd watch, all the big teams, but I was fascinated by the Sheffield Eagles for some reason. They tried to get a Paris club going. I remember Paris Saint-Germain. There was a lot of big fuss there, and so my initial exposure to league comes from TV. And then when I was playing rugby union, occasionally someone would have the idea of let's play a bit of league in the summer for fitness, and oh my god, it was hard. It was such a hard, and I was a forward, a second row forward, and I'm just like, we're not doing that anymore. I mean, I hated touch anyway as fitness, but like rugby league as fitness in the summer was just a nightmare for me. So I found a way to get out of those. But it's like I said, it's a sport I love and have come to appreciate. I've been to 2 rugby league World Cup finals. I try and but it's one of I just because of where I'm from, I don't feel that same connection as
No,
I
of course
do
not.
to Union, and linking it back to Swinton. I mean, Swinton obviously became a rugby league, but in my research, they were one of the holdouts. They didn't initially join the Northern Union in 1895 when the big breakaway from the schism in rugby. But then when all their local rivals joined, they were like, well, I guess it's time for and I understand in the 19th century it was a long coach ride to go down and play Oxford and people like that. So they quickly made the decision to throw their lot in with the Northern Union.
And the games have got much closer. I mean, I know a lot. A lot of the defensive coaches, the Andy Farrells of this world and Sean Edwards have come into rugby union, and it's now the games. Certainly defensively are a lot closer than they were. I mean, in the days when I was watching Swinton regularly, we used to occasionally go, myself and my brother actually, we used to occasionally go to see Manchester playing in Kersal Lane in just near where we lived, and we used to mock the tackling in rugby union. We used to say, well, of course, there's no tackling, nobody tackles properly, and we used to accuse them of forward passes that you'd get away with in rugby union, which you wouldn't in rugby league. But I think a lot of that sort of tribalism between league and union has sort of disappeared now. I mean, I happily watch rugby union, and in fact, I was talking to my brother during the World Cup when that really good quarter final was it France and
South Africa.
And we were saying that was the best rugby game of either code we've ever seen, because it was just fantastic. So, whereas in the old days, certainly when we were growing up, we would never admit to enjoying rugby union. I think the games, a lot of that was very childish, and it goes back to, sort of sham professionalism, etc., etc.
I think both sets of fans can unite and turn their attention to football fans. I think that's they're the real enemy, aren't they? So that's
absolutely.
We're just different codes. I mean, I think rugby union is for many, obviously it's the more global game, but it's in a difficult position. It's complicated its rules so much. It's also removed a lot of the physicality and some of that physical violence from the sport for legal and safety reasons. And you can look across to rugby league and you still see that physicality that at first attracted you to the game of rugby. And I know there's hypocrisy in that, but I don't think it's a sport. I think sometimes we try and legislate too much of the risk out of sport, and we have to understand that there's a risk in taking part in activities. And yes, we should try and mitigate that, but at some point, people have to accept a level of risk to play this, to do rock climbing, to do whatever it is. And I feel like what attracts a lot of people to the league is that physicality. And I think the best thing that rugby union could do is to make more space on the pitch. And the best way of doing it would be to get rid of flankers. But they won't do that because of 125 years of history. But yeah, there's good in both, and I feel like you can enjoy both, and I certainly do. And I obviously like hearing memories of people, from of their time supporting their team and yeah, all things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there were great days for Swinton in that big ground, grandiose, as I say, and really never going to get 60,000 into it. But the fact that, that what was a mining community got together and decided, and did it so fast, as you said, put up a ground that could host internationals. It was a fantastic achievement, really, which will never be, when you look at the budget for new stadiums now, Everton going to move and all that, and you consider that they there was the hope and the thought that rugby league was so big, we're going to have a 60,000 capacity stadium.
It's fantastic ambition, and I think it can. And you haven't said it, but I'll brag on behalf of Swinton. It's because in 1928 they won all four cups. They won all four cups that were available to them: so the Challenge Cup, the League, the Lancashire League, the Lancashire Cup. And I guess they just saw exponential growth, and they were like, "Yeah, 60,000. That seems fine. That's what we'll need."
Yes, well, how wrong they were, but for a time, for quite. I mean, certainly. Also, let's not forget the boom in sport in the post-war years. From 45 to say 55. So just before my time, there was a huge boom, and rugby league was part of that. Wigan Saints matches were always 49,000. Central Park Wigan was another one of those huge grounds. Like Swinton, no more. One of those huge grounds that the banking was full. Absolutely full, packed to the rafters. It would be 49,000. When it was a Wigan Saints match, every match was a league match, cup match, or whatever. But that was because people had got tired out by the war and rationing and everything else. There was a huge appetite for sport, and the working week was hard. People worked, 5.5 days. It wasn't a Monday to Friday thing. It was a Monday to Saturday lunchtime. I remember my dad worked till Saturday lunchtime, and then we'd go to the match after he'd finished work, and that was the routine. And you get to any of those places, whether it's Wigan or it's St Helens or it's Huddersfield or wherever, you'll find that people clocked off work at lunchtime and then would go to the match, and they would go to the match in huge numbers. 35,000 at Huddersfield, 49,000 at Wigan. It wasn't unusual. It didn't last long, that post-war boom, but it was because people had been tired out by the war and rationing and everything else. So for a while it was Swinton's 60,000 stadium probably looked a plausible proposition during those years. And I probably caught the sort of end of the post-war boom, really, in the the baby boomer generation, so it'd be the 60s when I started going.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time, and also that kind of element of community, which I guess is quite unique to the post-war period as well, in bringing people together. You're not, we were more confined to where we were born and where we lived, and there wasn't so much social mobility around, and so you were going to the match with your neighbours. You were the people in the next street from you, and I think it's obviously lost, but it doesn't mean that there's elements of it that we can't reminisce.
Absolutely. Another thing that is quite interesting reminiscing about is that outside you've probably seen the pictures of the old Station Road, and the Manchester Evening News is advertised on the side of the stand. So if you look at that big wooden main stand, it's got Manchester Evening News on it. And when you came out of the ground, there was a Manchester Evening News van that was actually, this sort of points to the decline of newspapers, but there was a Manchester Evening News van where they were printing out what we used to call the fudge, the stop press, on the side of the paper. So you would buy a Manchester Evening News as you came out of the ground at 4:35 when the match finished. You could buy a Manchester Evening News which would have the fudge printed on the side of the paper, the stop press, which would give you the latest scores in all the other matches. So you would get, if you had a peripheral interest in Manchester United, Manchester City, whatever, you would get the latest and a little report. You'd get a sort of mini report, but it would be, there would be a little printing press or whatever they would print with. And then you'd get the Manchester Evening News. It would have the latest scores. Then you'd get home and either watch the scores coming through on Grandstand. You probably would watch the scores coming through on Grandstand. Then you'd go out to the newsagent and wait for the football pink to arrive.
Or the football pink.
Or the football green. Manchester Evening News was the football pink. And you'd have a report. It'd be like 1,000-word report of the Swinton match that you'd been to in the afternoon. And obviously the lead would be United and City and all that. But, you would buy 2 evening newspapers, one, because obviously there's no internet, etc. You would buy 2 evening newspapers just to keep up with what's happening in the football and the rugby league.
I very vividly remember the football picks. My uncle was a referee secretary, and his job was to, as he was getting the results in from the referees, he would ring up the local newspaper, confirm the local football results, because obviously they would be covering the league matches, and then honestly, before 6 o'clock. We had the football pink, and it was there, and we were reading it in the evening about the games that happened in the afternoon, and that's just it's mad, sort of thinking about that technology and the manpower that would have gone into that. But the demand obviously had to be there for them to do that, because they're running it as a commercial enterprise. It's just obviously it's far too easy just to pull up the scores on your phone as you're in the game and is in the ground now. But just it just shows what a big deal sport was at that time. It's to your point in terms of that sort of post-war, but because people wanted that information, and there was enough money in it for people to not wait till Sunday, but you got it within an hour of the game ending. Mad.
Well, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's because, I suppose, in a way, it all comes down from mass industry. The people, there were lots of people to do all these things. That's, and over the years, obviously, because of technology and a variety of other reasons, there aren't the people about. I mean, you couldn't imagine the amount of manpower it took to get out that football pink for before 6 o'clock. And people would be queuing outside the newsagent when the van would go past and they'd throw the papers. It was unbelievable, really. And a 60,000 rugby league stadium is just symbolic and symptomatic of that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your memories, both of Station Road, but also of the sort of the time period and its heyday. It's a lost ground, one that's lost to history, but one that's a ground jewel nonetheless. And I'm glad we've been able to have spend this little bit of time reminiscing about it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you ever so much, James.